Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Today I have with me Bree Mills from Microchurch, Australia. Bree, it's great to have you here and thanks for giving me your time today. Now, I understand you're pretty fanatical about microchurches. Would you like to explain how you got into that whole area?
Yeah, I think microchurches, I often say that I accidentally stumbled into microchurches because I built something just literally following what I sensed the Spirit was leading me when I was doing youth ministry work. And then one day a guy came along and handed me a PDF of this book called Clusters, which had been written by a guy called Mike Bree, and said, I think this is what you've done in youth ministry. And so that was kind of how I got into the space. I was working with a small Anglican traditional church and a local high school, and the local high school kids were never going to step foot into the Anglican church. And so I just kept going, asking God, what do you want me to do with these guys? What do we do next? Okay, we meet at the school, now we meet at the local cafe, and now we've built a shed at the back of the church to meet in. And that's kind of how my journey with microchurches really started until, so that was probably, 2004 or so. And then moved into doing them with families and adults, following what I sensed God was calling me to do in about 2012, 2013.
That's great. And so at a church that you were previously at, you built a microchurch network. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so in response to just a sense of call that God laid on my heart and on my vicar's heart and on one of the members of our congregation, all at the same time, we kind of came together and had this sense that God was calling us basically to step outside of our church building. And so I'd stumbled across some reading on microchurches. The vicar had contacted somebody, and this person in our congregation had kind of found somebody else. And so the three of us came together and just started talking and praying about the possibilities. We got the staff team together and we did some training with an organisation back then called 3DM in Australia. And we started a pilot microchurch probably in 2013, I think. 2014.
Wow.
And just had a go, absolutely clueless of what we were doing.
So, Bree, I think the question on many people's lips is, what is a microchurch? Can you help?
Yeah, well, gosh, microchurches, I think, depending on who you're talking to, can be lots of things. The way I define them is that they're small gatherings of disciples of Jesus who are seeking to actively demonstrate God's love to the community around them. So they've got a heart for mission, they've got a desire to spend time in worship, and they're bonded together as a community. So for me, we often talk about it in 5 elements. It's got to be Jesus-centered, because we can have lots of groups that break into smaller communities and do so because they're upset with the way of the church or they're upset with other things.
Yeah.
But for me, microchurches have to start in that kind of God-driven, Spirit-empowered center that says Jesus is central, and we're doing this because we're surrendering our lives to Him and we want the world to know Him. And so they're Jesus-centered, and then as a community, they engage in some mix of worship, community, and mission, which are kind of the 3 kind of pillars we have to talk about in our microchurches, with the aim of moving to multiplication.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So go over those 5 again for me. There was Jesus-centered.
So they start with that kind of Jesus-centered heart, empowered by the Spirit, moved to actually just honour Jesus with their whole life. They meet together or they engage together in worship, and that, of course, isn't just music. That's whatever they can do to ascribe worth to God. They engage in community together in terms of fellowship, supporting. We often talk about living as family together and engaging together. And then they have a sense of shared mission. And I think there's 2 different types of missional communities in that space. Some have literally they are all together to reach this one people group. Others have more of a distributive model of they're all together to reach people, but those people might be different. So that's their mission. And then the final one is that it is seeking multiplication. They're not aiming to be big. They're aiming to be moving outwards.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess that missional intent is one of the biggest things that separates a microchurch from a traditional home group, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 2 things that we often talk about separating. One is that they've got that clear missional identity.
Yeah.
And the second one is that we often talk about the whole journey of discipleship.
Yes.
So if you're viewing discipleship from before people make a commitment to Christ all the way through till they're equipped and sent out to lead whatever it is that God's calling them in. Microchurches engage in that whole gamut, whereas
Good.
small groups often just are in that kind of how do we just grow and learn together stage.
So tell us about, how do you do discipleship in your microchurches?
Yeah, so look, over the years it's been done differently, but the key is it's contextual. So discipleship always needs to be responsive to the context. I don't know who said it, but the phrase rings in my mind that you don't disciple people in a vacuum. You're always discipling them from something to something. So therefore, when I'm discipling young families, the issues that they're struggling with and their need to align their lives to Jesus is different than when I'm discipling young adults who are at uni.
Yep. So would you say, as well as being contextual, discipleship in this context needs to be experiential as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's lived, and I think that's part of the family on mission, that community sense, is that discipleship doesn't just happen in, our, accountability groups of 3 or in, group. We often use discipleship groups of, small groups which really intent on discipleship. It doesn't happen in the programs. It actually happens more so in the life and the rubbing on each other as we're engaging in the world.
How many people would you say normally would be in a microchurch?
Look, they can vary. In Australia, I've found a lot of the research will say you can have up to 70. I would say that when you hit 30 to 40, you're really needing to multiply.
Yes.
Just because of the size of Australian households, and there's something about that school classroom feel that we like the feel of that 30 people. It feels like a healthy social group number, but beyond that seems to get a bit stretching.
Yeah.
So that's what we found. About that 30 to 40 mark, we tend to look for people to multiply.
You normally see that microchurches will stay in any form of network or have any form of overall covering or accountability outside of themselves?
I certainly hope so. That's why I set the network up that I did at GWAC, because I wanted to see these groups actually engaging in some accountability and for their own sake in some support and coaching and encouragement. I think one of the things I've learned since I've started doing some work around microchurches networks in Australia is that there are a lot of these microchurches around, and some of them have been around for 10, 20 years. This is not a new thing for a lot of the Australian church, but they haven't had any support. They haven't had any accountability.
So do you have a feel for how many microchurches would actually be in Australia?
I'd be happy to take a guess that there would already be a couple of hundred floating around Australia somewhere in the different networks that exist. Yeah,
no, that's interesting. Now, I know that you've said that one of the keys in seeing launching of microchurches is an exercise in discernment. Would you mind unpacking that for me?
Yeah, I think, I don't know, part of my experience, and I guess it was the way I came into leading microchurches, was simply the sense of feeling the sense of call to a particular people group or a particular place, and following Jesus into that call, empowered by the Spirit. And so I think we can often see these things as, the new program, and therefore we need to launch a series of microchurches because that's the cool new hip thing to do. But for me, it's all about discerning, is this what God is calling us to? Because I think God calls us to lots of different things, to social enterprises, to planting large churches. But I think the key is actually, what is God calling me, or even better, what is God calling us as a community into, and how are we responding to that in obedience?
So you've also said that you're most passionate, not just so much about using microchurches as a tool or a model, but in seeing people released to use their gifts in the fullness that God has actually intended for them. So do you mind just unpacking that a little bit more for me?
Yeah, I feel like it stirred for me when I did church history at Theological College, because they talked about how we've been released into the priesthood of all believers. And I remember sitting there going, but I'm not sure we have. Yeah. Like I sit in a church and I feel like the way we did church for a long time meant that a whole lot of people didn't get to play. There wasn't a role. You can welcome at the door, you could organise the parking. But I believe that God has actually gifted each and every person with all sorts of incredible gifts. And if we could just free them to be able to use them, to be able to identify them, and then to be able to partner with God's mission in those things, that we would see incredible revival in the church without even having to start new things or do anything, but just to release the potential that's already there.
Yes, I'm totally on board with that. It's the Ephesians 2:10 statement. Everyone has it, but we're God's workmanship. And
Yeah, that's right.
especially equipped for work that He's prepared in advance for us to do. And because of that, He's given us gifts to actually do that, which that's something I'm pretty passionate about, actually.
Yeah.
So with the whole thing of microchurches, did you have any point of revelation or vision at any point in time which really stirred you into this?
Yeah, look, there was one. I'd been playing around with microchurches in youth ministry, and had finished up at a church. I'd actually been pretty burnt out and taken almost 9 months off. And I got to this point where there was 2 churches that were both offering me positions in youth ministry. And I went along to this prayer night with a whole heap of other people. And I was literally asking, and I remember the question, even though I was asking God, which youth ministry jobs do you want me to take? The question I said was, God, what do you want me to do with my life? And I remember that question, and I had this incredible picture. Now, I'm not one for this usually, this has happened a few times in my life, and part of me thinks it's because of my stubbornness not to hear God when He speaks in other ways, that He has to be a bit bold. But I had this picture of the church that I was in has these little square windows, and there was these people reaching their hands out these tiny square windows and trying to bring people in. And I was standing behind them going, what are we doing? This is ridiculous. The people won't even fit through those windows. And then it cut to a second vision of standing on the corner of where this church was built and walking down the main road in a big clump of people, and people were walking and going and knocking on people's doors, and they were coming out and joining us. And it was a party. It was a party down the street of joy and hope and community. And this happened before I'd really understood what we'd done with microchurches as much. And that was the picture. And I remember getting to the end of it and going, I don't really know what that means for these 2 youth ministry jobs, but it was a picture of one of the churches. So I went and worked at that church. Yeah. And I actually worked at that church. I emailed my vicar the vision that I'd seen, and I said, I don't know what to make of this. I sent it to him. I worked for him for 18 months after that, until God called me out of youth ministry and reminded me and my vicar of that vision that He'd given me 18 months beforehand.
Yeah, wow.
And I had no context of it at the time. I'd always thought myself as the lifelong youth pastor, because that's where mission generally happened in the church. So, it was one of those things where I almost had to laugh that God had told me 18 months earlier what He wanted me to do, and it had taken me that long to work out what He was calling me into. So it was it was one of those moments where the penny really dropped, and I got a real sense of call. And that was really important, because leading out a network of those sorts of communities in a traditional Anglican church wasn't an easy thing to do. Yeah. And I think God, by His grace, gave me that call so that I would hold tightly to it when things got a bit rocky around me.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's often a very emotional time when God gives a call like that, isn't it? And even when we think about it further down the line.
Totally.
The Holy Spirit stirs in our hearts. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Bree, would you mind just telling us a little bit about Microchurch Australia that you've been involved in forming?
Yeah, so we're just a very small organisation at this stage, but we've got a real heart to support and encourage microchurch leaders. It came out of a book group that I ran September, October last year. I had a couple of people who said, can you, I know you do this microchurches stuff. We're going to read this book by Brian Sanders. Will you read it with us? And I said, oh, sure, I can work you through that book. And then it was like, do you mind if I invite some friends? And so in the end, we had a book group with about 30 people reading through this.
A microchurch book.
A microchurch book. And it just became really apparent in that space that there was so much interest in the Australian church at the moment for exploring microchurches. Coming out of COVID, there was just an openness that, like, I've been in this space for, 7-8 years now, and there's never been the openness that there is right now to explore different ways of doing church. And through that kind of network, I picked up a whole lot of people who were running microchurches with very little support or encouragement or anyone else that they knew was doing it. And so there was a couple of emails that I'd get that would be like, oh, I'm so glad I found you. There's someone else to talk to about this. And it just felt like I didn't want to start a network. I've been involved in lots of those sorts of missional networks before, but it got to the point where I felt like I feel like I would be led, like I just need to support these people. There is something on my heart that God is saying we have to get something in place so that these people can learn from one another, and particularly to learn for the Australian context. Like microchurches have been trialled in the US and in the UK, and there's great learning, but Australia is so different.
Yes, it
and
is.
We actually need to cultivate an environment for learning and collaboration that is uniquely Australian for how this would work for the Australian church and what God is calling the Australian church into at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's fantastic. So just in finishing off, I'm aware of the fact that you're doing some study at the moment. You're actually doing your PhD, and microchurches are part of the focus of that. Would you mind just telling us what the main theme of the PhD and why you feel stirred to actually study this?
Yeah, my doctoral supervisor would love it if I could tell you what the main theme was in a nice succinct sentence, but I'm not there yet. My heart is really to work out how do we form leaders for this sort of church. So microchurch leaders, they don't need to be clergy, they can be lay leaders, they can be people who are have part-time jobs doing or full-time jobs doing other things. How do we actually engage them in a process of formation that would adequately equip them to lead these sorts of expressions of church? I was really taken by a book that I read a long time ago by John Cotter called Accelerate, which has this kind of dual systems model of church. And it talks about how there's the traditional waterfall hierarchical model, and we need that, but we also need this kind of agile innovation kind of entrepreneurial model, and the two need each other.
Yes.
And really need to work together. And I sense that we've got our theological colleges and other places do a great job of training leaders and developing leaders for that standard traditional model of church, which we need and we're going to need moving into the future.
Yes.
But how do we form these sorts of leaders, these agile innovators who are often at the edges of our churches, and maybe even if we're church pastors, kind of nipping at our heels and aggravating us somewhat? How do we actually form them so that they are godly, well-rounded leaders who can actually multiply microchurches?
Yeah, it's great. You just mentioned bivocational. Do you think that bivocation was got to be an area of growth in Australian ministry in the future?
I think it's going to have to be. I think we're going to reach a point just financially within churches that a lot of churches aren't going to be able to support the ongoing kind of full-time paid model that we have now. And I also think there's some benefit for church pastors to be involved in their local community. So one of the church leaders that I coach at the moment is I think you call her a bartender. She works at a bar and she plants a church. And those two things actually work really well together.
It would do.
Yeah. And I know of other people who worked in coffee shops and planted churches. And there is something to be said for church planters and church pastors being actively engaged in their community. And I think the bivocational model gives them a really good reason to do that. Yeah,
no, that's great. Hey, Bree, I really appreciate your comments today. Love what you're doing. And
thanks, Tim.
Just really looking forward to seeing what happens in the future of Microchurch Australia, but also to learning from what you do through your doctoral studies as well. So
thanks,
thank you and bless you.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.